that some of you were able to hear that. I'm learning that when we play videos in church, the sound quality is quite different than when I listen to them at home. So we will work on that. My guess is online, you were able to hear it quite clearly. But William Barber there is talking about our response as Christians, and he's talking, in fact, about the passage that we had today where people come to Jesus at the time of judgment, and he says, well, did you work on love and justice? Did you work on justice and mercy? Those are part of your call. So, will you pray with me? Holy One, you move among us in mysterious ways. Sometimes you move in the song of Nina Simone. Sometimes you work in the voice of our youngest church participant, and sometimes you work in the words of a sermon. I pray today that all who are gathered here may find your Spirit moving through this service, whether in the words, in the music, or in the community. There's a podcast that I like to listen to sometimes called By the Book. The two podcasters tackle self-help books that they tackle self-help books. Hang on, let me change this from seeing myself to seeing the people here. There you are. Hello, everybody. So yes, they tackle self-help books. They read a book, a self-help book. They attempt to boil it down to its basic rules, follow those rules by the book for 2 weeks. The results, as you might imagine, are funny and frustrating. I would not want to follow these rules by the book. And for the most part, the results are largely unsatisfactory in catalyzing any meaningful, long-lasting change in the author's lives. The vast majority of self-help books they cover end up feeling like a sham, empty promises for a changed life. Sometimes the podcasters end up feeling worse than they did before they read the book. I don't know if y'all have ever read a self-help book. I feel that way a lot of times when I read these books. Even when they followed books that I love, that I'm excited for them to follow, there is something that gets lost in translation. The method of reducing an entire complex work into a few numbered instructions to follow precisely and expecting it to change lives, it just might result in disappointment every time. That reflection feels especially prescient today as we end our 3-part series on the Sermon on the Mount. I could see how this teaching collection of Jesus' sayings might easily be misunderstood as a self-help manual, full of unachievable instructions that leave the reader feeling worse about themselves than when we started. I don't think that that is Jesus' intention. And I hope that after this 3-part series, you won't read it that way either. First, let's review where we've been. In the first opening portion of the speech, we were reminded that we are blessed, just as we are. In the second middle portion, the most significant in terms of actual teaching content, we were reminded at the beginning and at the end that all of these teachings emerge from and fulfill Jewish teachings. It's especially important because often that kind of rhetoric about Jesus has come to abolish the law is used to enable anti-Semitic thought. So it's important to remember that Jesus began and end this teaching portion with announcing that he is here to fulfill the law. The speech then offers guidance on how to live in the present reality while we reach for a new future. Number 1, ethical, righteous relationship. Number 2, anchored in prayer. And number 3, non-anxious trust in the future. So today we turn our attention to the ending bracket of the speech, a collection of parables nicknamed as the eschatological warnings. I almost had that in the bulletin, and Kathy warned me off of it. Remember that eschatology is having to do with the study of end times. So it typically refers to the end of life, Judgment Day, Jesus' second coming. Eschatological warnings, then, mean that scholars understand this section to be a series of warnings related to the end of life or the time of judgment. We heard from last week from theologian Sally McFaig a different way of thinking about eschatology. Her way of thinking is a vision for a different kind of world, compelling us toward the future. And today we heard from, some of us may have heard, depending on our hearing, from William Barber II, who's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for revival, moral revival, about a different way of looking at end times or salvation. As is often the case, the parables of Jesus that we heard today are confusing to read at first. A narrow gate, fruit trees, a foolish house builder. Each of these is honestly worth a sermon by itself, and I hope that I am with you long enough to get around to preaching all of them. But taken together as a unit, there is something here that seems to be calling for an authentic effort, one that roots deep, puts forth effort, and avoids ostentatiousness. It seems that Jesus, through Matthew, is offering us a reminder about the importance of putting things into practice. Rather than trying to complete a checklist for his approval, he urges us with this ending into letting the practices of his teachings sink into our bones and shape our lives. The Sermon on the Mount, while not a checklist, is painting a vision of a different world, a new world, and inviting us to step into that world with our lives. It asks of the listeners to make deep, meaningful change on how we live our lives. When we're trying to make change in our lives, deep change, some fairly predictable patterns or challenges occur. The work that many of us have undertaken in undoing our internal racism reminds me a bit of these pitfalls. Or maybe you can relate to them in a deep change you've tried to make in your lives. These three parables about the narrow gate, about the ravenous wolves and tree of bad or good fruit, about the house built on sand, reflect some common responses when we try to make change in our lives. Response to change 1. We discover that the change is harder than we thought to make. We might run into difficulty or get pushback from family or friends. We might feel pressure to stay in the comfortable pattern that they are familiar with. Another translation, instead of the narrow gate, is pressed or squeezed. We might feel like we're being pressed or squeezed on both sides when we're trying to make a change in our lives about the way we live. For the gate is narrow, it presses, and the road is hard that leads to life. Response to change number 2. When it gets hard and we don't feel like we know what we are doing, we look around for leaders and guides, hoping they'll make the shift easier with their how-to list. This is my favorite. I really love reading a to-do list when I don't know what I'm doing. It's comforting to follow someone else out for ourselves. But as the podcast by the book shows, the self-help genre is full of empty promises, of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. The slow process of change takes time and is often invisible. We are reminded, though, that a good tree cannot bear bad fruit. They just take a long time to bear fruit. Response to change number 3. Once you envision the result you want, it can be tempting to be changed as quickly as possible. Presto. Change shows that we love to watch. Five Guys, what's it called? Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. No. Anyways, I like boom, boom, ba-doom, boom, boom. But it is hard to go through the slow, laborious process of internal transformation. We want to throw up a house of change for all to see. Once we can see it, we want to be it. But what makes real transformative change that lasts is when we take time to dig out and unearth the old stories, the narratives that are driving us, and lay a new, solid foundation before we build up and out. These 3 examples point to the importance of a deep internal response to Jesus' teachings on the Sermon on the Mount. Rather than contorting ourselves as if on a game of Twister to hit all the right buttons, we're asked to take them in and allow them to change our internal being. To, as Nina Simone put it, live like I'm longing to live, to embody Jesus' words. And at the center of these 3 parables, Matthew does this all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. He builds the text to kind of point to the center. In the whole teaching portion, the center was the disciples' prayer. And here, the central portion of this part of the text, Matthew has placed the key concept, an interaction that is imagined to take place at the moment of judgment. So here again, it is important to remember that Jesus was Jewish. So his understanding of judgment was not our contemporary Christian concept of heaven and hell. You're worth it, you got in, you don't get in, okay? That's not what this judgment day is referring to. It's one rooted in Jewish religious thought with much less emphasis on punishment. Jesus tells folks at this imagined final moment, which is why it's called the eschatological warnings, that it was neither their empty he wanted, nor their endless activity, prophesying in your name, casting out demons in your name, and doing many deeds of power. Jesus wants instead their embodied selves, doing the best they can to faithfully live out the will of God. To live out the will of God. Jesus wants people who are free, who have enfolded these teachings of the Mount into their very selves, weaving the teaching into their lives. He is disinterested in cultivating minions whose primary worry is over the proper way to worship and praise. Nor does he want worker bees who fill their lives trying to meet as many imagined requirements as possible. Nina Simone sang about a different era and a different experience than many of us know. But when she sings, "I wish I knew how it would feel to be free, and I wish I could share all the love in my heart," our souls cannot help but resonate with that. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things that I can do. Though I'm way overdue, I'd be starting anew. In this last portion of the Sermon on the Mount, we are called to be deep, authentic livers, followers of the one who causes us to change our hearts and minds, followers who push past the empty gate, the narrow gate of pressure of conformity, who avoid empty promises of quick change, who dig into the marrow of the world and put down tentacles that hold them fast to life. May we be called into change that is life-giving and that changes the world. May we follow this way. Amen.